This is the lecture for Module 3. We are reading about the Panpsychist turn in Analytic philosophy of mind. Now, Analytic philosophy is, many would say, the dominant school of academic philosophy in the 20th century, especially in the English-speaking world. You may have found the essays for this module to be difficult. You may have found the style tedious. There's a lot of conceptual machinery being deployed in an attempt to precisely define and categorize different logical positions. Analytic philosophers love to construct arguments about very specific issues. They love to explore the conceptual terrain within a very narrow focus, within a very narrow field. And this can be incredibly helpful when we know what the problems are that we are trying to solve. And so, in the last module, we explored the hard problem of consciousness. And so the reason that there has been a panpsychist turn among analytic philosophers of mind is that they've explored this particular problem, the hard problem of consciousness, and they've ended up realizing, many of them, that panpsychism, or the idea that the mental is fundamental, this panpsychist position they've discovered is actually one of the most logically coherent ways of solving the problem. It's also parsimonious in the sense that it requires the fewest assumptions, because analytic panpsychists in general, and we'll go through some of the distinctions that are made in the essays that I assigned for this module. In general, these analytic panpsychists, they want to avoid what is called strong emergence. Some of these authors call this super strong emergence, and they want to avoid this discontinuity in nature, in the physical world. They want to avoid a discontinuity in the continuum of causality, because, if reality can be understood rationally, it's because it obeys certain causal laws, right? It's because we can recognize certain principles, formal principles at work in the events of the physical world. If this is not the case, right, if there is no rational explanation of reality, then analytic philosophy it's barking up the wrong tree. It's pointless. So analytic philosophers, one of their presuppositions generally is that reality has a logical structure that can, in principle, be exhaustively rationalized and understood. And that this understanding would take the form of some logical formalism, right? Some proof in, ideally, a kind of symbolic logic. That's the sort of rigor and precision that analytic philosophers are ultimately looking for. And when they turned their attention to the hard problem of consciousness, many of them began to argue that panpsychism was the only solution to this problem. So you may find the readings a little bit boring. You may get dizzy with all of the logical gymnastics, but this is an exercise in clear thinking and precise thinking, and there are various ways to lay out the conceptual terrain, various ways of conceiving of what it is possible to think about the mind's relationship to nature. And I want to thank you for your patience if you did find these readings tedious, because we're going to move on to, I hope, more exciting approaches to the study of consciousness. But I really think we needed to do our push-ups, or we needed to do some exercise. We needed to make sure that we can speak and think clearly. And so analytic philosophy is at its best, an exercise in clear thinking, and to do metaphysics, to do philosophy, to understand the mind and its relationship to the physical world, we're going to need to think clearly. We're going to need to define our terms. So, that's why I'm including analytic philosophers in this course on consciousness. So something that's important to keep in mind here is that Alfred North Whitehead, who is, the patron saint of process philosophy, right? He's not the first process philosopher, and he certainly won't be the last, but Whitehead is, in a way, with Bertrand Russell, who was his student initially, he is one of the inaugurators of the analytic approach to philosophy. Whitehead and Russell, of course, were the co-authors of the Principia Mathematica, and they published several volumes beginning in 1910, I believe. And they were supposed to publish another volume, but they started to run into problems, right? Trying to exhaustively ground mathematics in logic, they ran into certain paradoxes, and the logician and mathematician Kurt Gödel later formalized these paradoxes. And Russell and Whitehead, in originating this new method of philosophy, right, trying to reduce everything to propositions in symbolic logic, right, in a sense trying to purify language so that it enabled us to access precisely the logical structure of reality. They inaugurated this, ran into problems, and Russell, rather than admit that the failure of this project, of the Principia project, was a signal that we needed to shift our assumptions, our premises, rather than just rush into the arguments and the proofs. What are our axioms, right? Rather than focus on that, as Whitehead did, Russell really banged his head against this same old analytic method. Now, Whitehead was freed by the failure of the Principia project. Whitehead was freed into speculative metaphysics, where all of a sudden he's saying, philosophy is not about arguments. Philosophy is not about deductions. Philosophy can use logic as a tool, but ultimately, philosophy is the search for premises. That's what Whitehead says. For premises. And we search for premises by trying to arrive at the most generic descriptions of experience that we possibly can. So Whitehead breaks free of the analytic method he founds, articulates a new method of speculative philosophizing, and ends up constructing a process ontology, or a process relational ontology. And Whitehead's new method of speculative philosophy owes a lot to William James's radical empiricism and pragmatism, right? James describes his philosophy as a kind of mosaic philosophy. Whitehead calls this philosophy in the mode of assemblage, right? We're trying to be systematic, but we really don't know what our premises should be yet. And so we're assembling generalizations from our experience, knowing that the edges of our experience are frayed, and there's always going to be more. So we pursue metaphysics as an effort to assemble insights derived from experience that can be generalized, insights derived from particular experiences that can be generalized to other forms, other modes of experience, so that, what we learn from science, what we learn from religious experience, what we learn from art and aesthetic experience, what we learn from practice, these can all be synthesized because we're able to translate between experiences in one domain into experiences of another domain because we've revealed the generic structure of experience as such. In this module, we're going to run through some of the logical distinctions and the categories, the typologies that were articulated in these essays that we read. And as we go along, I'm going to sort of interpolate Whitehead and show how while analytic philosophers want to zero in on these very specific problems, Whitehead is trying to take a step back and do something precisely opposite that. Rather than focusing on just these specific problems, he's saying, well, what are these problems presupposing? What's the imaginative background that is presupposed by the hard problem of consciousness, right? How did it come to be that consciousness is a problem for us? And so many of these analytic thinkers, they just take materialism and rationalism for granted, instead of questioning how these schools of philosophy, and let's throw empiricism in there too, how did these schools of philosophy ever come to be so divided from one another? As if we didn't have important things to learn from our sense experience, from our logical reflection, and from our mystical intuition, right? Clearly, if we're going to understand the nature of reality, we're going to need to learn something from all the schools of philosophy. So Whitehead can think analytically, right? But he can also think in an integral way. And we're going to try to learn from him in response to these contemporary analytic philosophers who are all of a sudden, in the last decade or so, very interested in panpsychism. Kind of surprising. So it's tempting to describe Whitehead's way of doing metaphysics as a kind of phenomenology, right? If he's trying to describe experience, isn't he doing phenomenology? Edmund Husserl developed a phenomenological approach to philosophy, building really on Kant, building on Descartes in a way, and you might say he's trying to describe experience. And it's a form of transcendental idealism. Now, Whitehead, while you could, in a very loose way, call him a sort of phenomenologist, he's not doing what Husserl is doing. And allow me to distinguish Whitehead from this more idealistic approach. Whitehead is a realist. He's an organic realist, right? That's his phrase. Whitehead's thought is different from the phenomenological approach, which is different again from the analytic approach, right? So analytic philosophy is different from, it's usually opposed to continental philosophy or phenomenology. There's also a school of thought that's continental called post-structuralism. You can be phenomenological and post-structuralist, but these are not identical forms of, continental thought. To be a post-structuralist is, you're sort of saying that there is no pure or universal structure to the nature of reality, right? There aren't these universal structures. Instead, there's just these historical structures of knowledge and power, or knowledge power, you might even say. Foucault called them epistemes. They're historic, contingent, power-based structures and ways of knowing that reveal certain structures. So whatever, science thinks is objectively true must be historicized, is in a sense relative to the structure of power that established that form of knowledge during that historical period. That's the post-structuralist view. The phenomenologist, like Husserl, is still looking for a kind of universal structure, something that isn't just historically contingent. Husserl wanted to discover a kind of pure experience, right? Similar to what James was describing. This would be something truly ontological that isn't merely historically constructed by a system of power at a certain historical moment. And, Whitehead's process orientation here is a different perspective again, right? And so we're going to try to navigate through all these various options for thinking about, again, the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the universe. So some of the terms that are unpacked in these articles, in these chapters, include constitutive panpsychism, right? And that's opposed to non-constitutive forms of panpsychism. We might call these non-constitutive forms emergent panpsychism. There's also cosmopsychism, right? Where cosmopsychism takes a more holistic approach, right? And so instead of trying to build up our human level and human kind of consciousness out of smaller mental particles, or mentons, if you will, cosmopsychism says that the real unity, the only concrete unity that we know of, is actually the universe as a whole. And if we're going to solve the hard problem, then what we need to do is not say that the fundamental particles are somehow conscious or proto-conscious, but instead say that the universe as a whole is conscious. And that our consciousness, our human level, meso-consciousness, if you will, is derived from the macro-consciousness. So cosmopsychism is a kind of holism. I find it difficult to distinguish from idealism. We'll see how Meixner's Husserlian form of phenomenological idealism is quite similar to cosmopsychism. It's a holism, right? Now, constitutive panpsychism then would be more of a reductionism. It's the reductionistic approach to panpsychism, where just like a reductionistic materialist, a reductionistic or constitutive panpsychist says that our kind of minds are derived from smaller minds, from a kind of mind dust, right, as William James called it more than a century ago. And the laws that determine the behavior of that mind dust, which for most constitutive panpsychists, those are the physical laws. There's nothing that mentons do that contradicts or disobeys the laws of physics, according to constitutive panpsychists. And so our level of mind is only weakly emergent as far as a constitutive panpsychist is concerned, meaning that the term of art that they use is supervenience. The human mind, human consciousness, supervenes on its lower level constituents. And the panpsychist, constitutive panpsychist, says that these constituents are both physical and mental, but doesn't give the mental any capacity to alter or shift the course of physical events. The course of physical events is, as science describes it, a kind of deterministic mechanism as far as the constitutive panpsychist or the reductionistic panpsychist is concerned. Now, there are these non-constitutive forms of panpsychism, and, to give this form a kind of negative name is, of course, already to accept the premises of the constitutive panpsychist, because the constitutive panpsychist is saying those are all the people that disagree with me who also think they're panpsychists. And so we should give a positive name to this realm of thought within the panpsychist way of thinking, and let's call it emergent panpsychism. So I would say that the idea of strong emergence, the idea that mental agency or free will, right, our agency as conscious beings, is itself not reducible to lower level constituents. Like, the conscious decisions and choices that I make are not reducible to the decisions made by my cells, and the decisions made by my cells are not reducible to the molecules and atoms that compose them, right? So non-constitutive panpsychists are going to say that no, something new emerges in the course of evolutionary history when you get human consciousness. Maybe they're also going to say something new emerges when you get living organisms, right? There are real breaks in nature, mutations, if not breaks, in nature, so that this notion of a continuity may be misleading. There are this continuity is punctuated by mutational events, right? And new kinds of nature become possible. James was really worried about this possibility. He wanted continuity, right? Non-constitutive panpsychists, though, are saying, they're not saying that experience or consciousness as such emerges. What they're saying is that new forms of it emerge that are non-reducible to the earlier forms, that there's real novelty. And so emergentism in this sense is, I would say, almost straddling or trying to hold the tension between cosmopsychist holism and constitutive panpsychist reductionism. And, where does Whitehead fit in all of this? Well, I think Whitehead agrees, actually, with the cosmopsychists that there is a kind of cosmic consciousness. Whitehead calls it God. But he also agrees with the constitutive panpsychists in a way that all organized wholes in nature, which Whitehead called them atoms, he also called them actual occasions. He said that there's a physical and a mental pole to every actual entity, to every actual occasion of experience, and that goes all the way down. Now, because Whitehead agrees with the cosmopsychists and the constitutive or reductionistic panpsychists, he's clearly trying to carve out a space for thinking that is different from either of them, because they think they're in a disagreement with each other, and Whitehead's saying, no, you're both right, to a certain degree, but, so does that make Whitehead an emergentist? Well, yeah, in a way. But he's not saying that mind emerges from matter. He's not saying that consciousness miraculously appeared at some point in evolutionary history when neurons arranged themselves in the right way. He's saying that experience is a continuum. It's been present from the beginning of this universe, but that at various stages along the way, experience has organized itself so as to produce more intense forms of itself. And that there are some moments in evolutionary history where a leap is taken, a creative advance occurs. And in some ways, you could say that Whitehead's ontology is saying that there is an example of strong emergence with every moment that passes, in the course of cosmogenesis, that each concrescence of each actual occasion, and there are, the universe is made of infinitely many concressing actual occasions, but each one of them represents something new, something novel, something which has never occurred before, which is, an advance upon the past, an inheritance of, but also an advance upon the past. So Whitehead says that concrescence, each of these drops of experience, is the many becoming one and being increased by one, right? The entire past, in all of its multiplicity, floods into each new moment of experience, which takes a perspective on that, and then leaps into the future to add itself as a new perspective, to this cresting wave of cosmogenesis. And the universe is never the same twice, right? So Whitehead is a form of, I would say, emergent. He's an emergentist panpsychist, if you will, which is to say that he really does think that there is a process of creative emergence underway, of emergent evolution is a phrase that he uses in Process and Reality. But he's also preserving the continuity that James went to great pains to preserve, right? There are no leaps from mere stuff, mere physical particles colliding according to mechanistic laws. There's no leap from that to an experiential, interior, subjective realm of consciousness. Some form of subjectivity was present from the very beginning for Whitehead. While in a sort of Whiteheadian way, when you have atoms and then molecules and cells and then multicellular animal life, right, and then human consciousness, these are emergent events where a mutation occurs and nature is never the same again. But for there to be an emergence that would take you from mere mechanistic physics to mind and emotion and subjectivity, that would be super strong emergence, and Whitehead rejects that, right? Even though he is a strong emergentist in a different way. So there are different ways of thinking about emergence, right, that get unpacked in these chapters. There's weak or conservative emergence, which is just a sort of epistemological issue where we don't yet know enough about the system in question to understand how its components give rise to the behavior of the whole system, but we could come to know how that's possible in a reductionistic way so that we fully understand it. Then there's strong or radical emergence, which we might want to call ontological. But at this point, we're talking about the emergence of a level like of behavior or capacity, like consciousness, that cannot, even in principle, even if we knew everything about how the components were interacting, we would never be able to derive the higher level process. So even if we knew everything there was to know about neural activity in the skull, and the information streaming into the senses, that still wouldn't give us an explanation for the emergence of consciousness. Consciousness is a higher level reality with a sort of downward influence upon its component parts. This is called downward causality sometimes. So merely epistemic emergence would say that there is no downward causality. All of the causation is happening at the level of the parts, and if we understand the behavior of the parts, we understand the behavior of the whole. Right? That's weak emergence or epistemological emergence. Other authors call it conservative emergence. Whereas strong or radical or ontological emergence has to do with downward causation, where the emergent whole, the emergent property, the emergent capacity actually institutes new rules, new laws, new behaviors that were not present in the parts and that cannot be derived from the parts. Now, analytic philosophers generally are going to want to prefer to avoid strong emergence, where they want to maintain a continuity. They want to maintain the causal closure of physics, right? Which is this idea that many of these analytic panpsychists they hold it dear. They think that science requires that we accept the causal closure of nature, where an understanding of the physical laws would give us an understanding of consciousness, right? A complete understanding of the physical laws would give us an understanding of consciousness, an explanation of consciousness. That's what most constitutive analytic panpsychists are arguing for. So they're really ceding a lot of territory to reductionism, right? Whitehead says science is not a fairy tale. He took physics and chemistry and biology and physiology. He took these sciences very seriously. He says science is not a fairy tale. But he also knows that science is always dealing with models. Its objects are very often abstractions, and they're really refined abstractions that are constructed by way of experiment, by way of mathematical elaboration. But these are models, and the determinism is part of the model, not necessarily part of the reality that is attempting to be modeled, right? Because after all, one of the presuppositions of the scientific enterprise is that there is a knower, there is a mind capable of framing hypotheses, testing them, and elaborating them into theoretical truths, right, that we hold are operative in nature. This presupposes cognition. It presupposes consciousness. So, as Whitehead put it in one of his books, The Function of Reason, kind of poking fun at reductionistic scientific materialists, he says, scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject of study, right, for the philosopher. So, Whitehead wants to acknowledge the power of science, but, warn us against what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Do not mistake the model for the reality. And others, Alfred Korzybski, a great logician and philosopher, was famous for making a distinction between the map and the territory, right? The territory remains unknown. Even if we think we've mapped it, there's always more to map. There's a fractal edge to the continent, right? And we can never finally copy what reality is doing with our models. And so we have to recognize what science is doing when it builds models. And not mistake the determinism of the model for the determinism of concrete reality, because concrete reality is full of surprises. Concrete reality is a movement out of an inherited past into an uncertain future. And in each concrete moment, in the passage of nature through each concrete moment, potential is playing just as much a role as what has already been actualized, right? So the causal push of the past is an important influence on the present moment, but so is the anticipatory lure of the future, right? The realm of potential and the realm of actuality, they meet in the present. And the creative advance of nature is the offspring of this meeting, right, between the actualized past and the potential future. And so when we try to understand in a Whiteheadian process relational way how it is that conscious freedom, the imaginative freedom of our thought, how is this possible when what science has revealed about the physical world is also real? Well, it's possible because the physical world, which is what we are, including our consciousness, is itself a creative process. It's becoming new in each moment. And the mental side of that process is just as active and important in the formation of reality as the physical side. You might equate the mental with the potential and the physical with the actual, right? The physical has to do with the actualized past. The mental has to do with the potential future. These two meet in the present. Whitehead's process relational panpsychism is the story that he tells out of these basic ingredients. So Whitehead rejects the causal closure of physics. For him, the laws of physics are habits. They've emerged in the course of evolutionary time. They're not fixed. They're not final, so there is no closure, right? And here, Whitehead is aligning himself with the great American pragmaticist and an important influence on William James's pragmatism, Charles Saunders Peirce, who also saw nature as a continuum, as a continuous process, and nature as developing certain habits. And those habits can be construed in scientific models as laws, and they can be mathematically modeled, right? But over the course of evolutionary time, they're changing. And so the principle of causal closure, as far as Whitehead and Peirce and other evolutionary thinkers are concerned, nature is not complete. Its causal laws are not closed, not finished. There's a process of emergent evolution underway, and it's not just new species of organism that are evolving, it's new environments. And when we talk about the widespread habits of nature, we're talking about the cosmic environment, the milieu within which these organisms are evolving. And as those organisms evolve, they evolve with their environment. So in other words, it's not just organisms that evolve, it's environments too. So Whitehead is, he's describing his philosophy as organic realism. And for him, an organism is part of a system. It's interrelated with its environment. There is an organism-environment event, if you will, and there are systematic relationships binding what appears to be a separate organism with its environment. And that environment is really a community of other organisms. So you might say Whitehead's replacing physics as the fundamental science with ecology, the study of, doing ontology, the study of the things that there are, is a form of ecology, because what there are finally are organisms in co-evolving relationships. The last part of this lecture is going to focus on Seeger's essay and Meixner's essay. As I said earlier, Seeger is very close to Whitehead's position, so I want to look more closely at what he's saying. And Meixner, in articulating Husserl's Phenomenology, claiming it as a form of panpsychism, I think he provides an ideal contrast to Whitehead's organic realism, right? Meixner is an idealist, panpsychist. Whitehead is a realist panpsychist, and I think it will be helpful to go through what Meixner says to differentiate Whitehead so we better understand the uniqueness of his process relational panpsychism. So Seeger, his essay is called Combinatorial Infusion, and he admits right at the beginning that consciousness has resisted assimilation into the scientific world picture. For the scientific world picture, by which we basically mean scientific materialism, consciousness appears to be a kind of strange intrusion into an otherwise well-behaved world. Now, I would add that the emergence of life is just as strange an intrusion into a materialistic universe as the intrusion of consciousness. And once we start to study theoretical biology in the next module, Module 4, reading Evan Thompson's work, we'll see why life is so different from the materialist mechanistic conception of the universe. So it's not just consciousness that is a strange intrusion, it's life as well. But Seeger is trying to offer a form of panpsychism that explains at least the intrusion of consciousness. And first, he runs through one of the attempts to make room for consciousness, which has, in the analytic school of thought, been to distinguish between physical concepts and phenomenal concepts, where physical concepts are those which describe the world studied by science, the world of matter and motion, right? And phenomenal concepts are those that describe our experience, what it feels like to see red, what it feels like, to hear music, what it feels like to be in pain, and so on. These would be things we think about in terms of phenomenal concepts, and science would use physical concepts, and we just have to agree that, both of these ways of thinking are valid when applied within their own domain. But Seeger's ultimately not happy with this because it still leaves this explanatory gap, right? How does, and the hard problem really drives this point home, how does the physical stuff in the brain that neuroscientists can think with their physical concepts, how does that relate to the feeling of pain, right? Or the sensation of redness that we think about with phenomenal concepts? How do we relate these two kinds of concepts? And, just saying that they're both valid ways of thinking within their own domains doesn't help us solve the really hard problem that we're interested in. So Seeger wants to go further, and this is why he thinks panpsychism is important. I mean, the other option, if we don't go with panpsychism, if we want to do away with this explanatory gap between the physical and the phenomenal, the other option is a form of eliminative materialism where you say, well, actually, phenomenal concepts aren't real. They're just illusions. You don't really see red. You don't really feel pain. These are just words that we use, and we delude ourselves into thinking that phenomenal reality exists, when really they're thinking and concepts, they're just, as Seeger refers to them, bare recognitional concepts. They allow for thinking, or what we might want to call information processing, without the need of any consciousness. So the alternative to panpsychism, saying that even those physical processes also have some mentality or experience associated with them, the alternative, if we want to get away from or do away with the explanatory gap, is eliminativism, right? Where we say, actually, we're no more conscious than rocks. And we'll explore eliminativism later on. It seems like an even more absurd position than dualism, where at least you have an explanatory gap, but at least you're not trying to get rid of your own intimate, immediate experience as just an illusion. Maybe dualism's incoherent, but it's at least not trying to eliminate the most obvious thing about human existence, which is our own consciousness. But materialists will say that panpsychism is absurd. Well, eliminativism clearly is at least just as absurd, or at least difficult to comprehend what's even being said, right? Because it's literally denying your capacity for comprehension. So Seeger wants to avoid the incomprehensibility of illuminative materialism and instead move forward with panpsychism, but he runs into the problem that David Chalmers articulates very well, the combination problem. We have David Chalmers to thank for clearly articulating the problems for us, right? The hard problem of consciousness and the combination problem for panpsychism. But, and that problem is, how do the little minds, the little subjects, add up to a big subject? How do the component parts that we are made of, the mentons, if you will, add up to our sense of conscious mentality? Because we experience ourselves as a kind of unity, right? I am me. I am not a sort of dust cloud, of little minds that are aimlessly wandering around, leaderless, right? There is a stream of consciousness that I can identify with and recognize as my own. How does that emerge from this multiplicity of smaller minds or smaller subjects? That's the combination problem. And Chalmers wasn't the first to articulate this. John Stuart Mill talked about it. William James, of course. And Seeger helpfully explores how John Stuart Mill framed this issue. Mill distinguished between merely mechanical combination, a kind of additive summing, right, of parts into an aggregate, and chemical combination, which would be more creative, more synthetic than mechanical combination, where in chemical combination the parts are transformed by being included in some larger whole. So it's not just a collection of pre-existing parts anymore. Chemical combination transforms the parts, gives rise to something new. A new unity emerges with chemical combination, whereas in mechanical combination, you just have more of the same, right? So that's the distinction Mill is drawing. And when William James picks up on this issue of combination later on in Principles of Psychology, it's the first place that James deals with it, he ends up assuming a kind of mechanical combination and doesn't really, he does say briefly a bit about what chemical combination would look like, but he doesn't pursue that as a solution. He just leaves the problem of combination there. The problem for mind dust theories, as he called them, or for these constitutive panpsychist views, is how do you get a bunch of feelings to add up to a new feeling that synthesizes or includes them all. Mill thought that there was a form of mental chemistry that allowed this to occur. James was unable to articulate this, but that's where Whitehead comes in and develops what he calls a theory of transmutation to understand how it is that, to use James's terms, a 101st feeling can creatively emerge out of the swarm of 100 feelings that preceded it, and that this 101st feeling can integrate, or in Whitehead's terms, transmute what came before it into a new unity. And Seeger mentions Whitehead's solution to the combination problem and says that he doesn't pretend to understand it. I'm going to try to explain it in a very simple way, using an artistic example that came to me actually in conversation with a student, actually, you know who you are. And hopefully this will illustrate what Whitehead is talking about when he talks about transmutation. I'll go there in a second. Whitehead, though, is trying to fill in a kind of explanatory gap here that he says that all monadic ontologies leave us with. In Process and Reality, Whitehead says that this category of transmutation is the way in which the philosophy of organism, which is the designation he gives his own philosophy, it's the way in which the philosophy of organism, which is an atomic theory of actuality, meets a perplexity which is inherent in all monadic cosmologies. Leibniz, in his short book Monadology, meets the same difficulty by a theory of what he called confused perception. but he fails to make clear how confusion originates. Now, in Leibniz's monadology, his understanding of how monads, which are infinite, can in some way be represented in our own perception is through what he calls confusion. He gives the example of walking along the seashore and hearing the sound of the ocean, this sort of dull roar that you hear, when you hold a conch shell up to your ear. You hear a mimicry of the ocean, at least. But he says that we know at the ocean there's innumerable droplets of water crashing into one another and into the sand. And what we hear is this confused murmuring. And that our perception is sort of a fusion or confusion of what is itself these distinct droplets or monads. Whitehead wants to unpack what must actually be going on there with his doctrine of transmutation. And for Seeger, this becomes a theory of infusion. So you've got Leibniz's confusion, you've got Whitehead's transmutation, and you've got Seeger's infusion, where Seeger says that his notion of combinatorial infusion is one wherein a new state diachronically substitutes for its precursors, so that the new state erases the multiplicity of its precursors. A new unity replaces the multiplicity of its precursors. This is very close to Whitehead's doctrine of concrescence, where the many become one and are increased by one. But in order to really grasp what work this category of transmutation does in Whitehead's process relational scheme, I want to use an example. So in Leibniz's example, he's using our sense experience of sound. To explain Whitehead's understanding of transmutation, we're going to use sight, the visual perception of color, and we're going to look at a very famous painting by the Parisian artist Georges Seurat. It's called A Sunday Afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jatte. And as you'll see in the video, it's a painting wherein if you really zoom in close, you see this array of colors in this woman's blue dress, whereas if you're looking at the painting, from a few feet away, you take in the whole. Your experience of color is always determined by context, right? And so for Whitehead, what transmutation means is the way in which at the micro level, there's all this multiplicity of color going on, whereas at the macro level of what we experience, normally, that micro multiplicity can transmute itself into a sort of macro simplicity. From multiplicity to simplicity or unity, where we can take in a higher level property, whereas at a lower level that property sort of disappears. It decomposes into parts that don't at all look like the whole. So this is a very simple example of what Whitehead means by transmutation. But this happens for Whitehead through a series of phases in the process of concrescence, and there's a lot going on in Whitehead's ontology when we think about how a concrescence takes its prehensions or its feelings of the multiplicity of the past, transmutes those into contrasts, and how those contrasts then grow together into a final subjective harmony, right, which then perishes as a new perspective, a new drop of experience to be added to the creative advance of nature that is then prehended by the next moment, right? So I'm not going to get into all of that, but I think this is a very simple example of transmutation so that you understand at least the basics of Whitehead's solution to the combination problem. For Whitehead, concrescence is the growing together of the many into the one, whereby the many are increased by one, right? This is the magical formula, if you will, wherein Whitehead's solution to the combination problem is explained. So let's transition now to Meixner's chapter, where he articulates a form of what he calls panpsychism that comes out of Edmund Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, which is a form of idealism. Meixner begins by, saying that he thinks panpsychism is incompatible with physicalism. You'll remember that various authors that we've read so far in this semester would fully disagree and say that, Galen Strawson, for example, would say that real physicalism must be panpsychism. You just have to come to see experience as something physical. That's Strawson's point of view. But Meixner here, without much explanation, is just taking the opposite view and saying, and he knows that this would be thought of as a kind of radical view in these panpsychist circles, to say that panpsychism and physicalism are incompatible. But that's what he says. And then he goes on to talk about these 4 different types of panpsychism. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. Maybe it's helpful for you. But, he distinguishes a holistic form of panpsychism he attributes to Spinoza, but that is still dualistic, because Spinoza kind of has a mind-matter parallelism where, the mental attribute of Spinoza is one substance and the physical attribute, they don't really communicate with each other. They just run in parallel. And so Meixner's not ultimately happy with Spinoza's, he calls it a holistic dualistic panpsychism. He then refers to another type of panpsychism called atomistic dualistic panpsychism, which is basically where he throws all of the analytic constitutive panpsychists who think of our level of consciousness as derived from a lower level of consciousness that is sort of intrinsic to physical particles, right? So that's the atomistic dualistic panpsychism. And then he distinguishes another type called atomistic idealistic panpsychism, which he attributes to David Hume, because for Hume, what there finally is are sensory impressions, right? And faded sensory impressions or ideas. That's Hume's, those are the categories that Hume works with, and he interprets everything in terms of a sensory impression, an association among sensory impressions, or a faded sensory impression or an idea in the mind, right? So Hume thinks of reality as, to the extent that he allows us to think about reality, as something mental ultimately. So sensory experiences are mental ultimately, but he conceived of sensation as atomistic. We had an experience ultimately for Hume of sensory atoms or qualities, and we assemble these in our mind into the everyday objects of the external world, like tables and chairs, and we assemble these sensations and faded sensations into what we think of as our self. For Hume, the internal self is an illusion, as are these external objects, because really what we experience are sensory impressions. And so Meixner categorizes Hume as an atomistic, idealistic panpsychist. Now, the 4th category is Meixner's preferred category of panpsychism, which he calls holistic, idealistic panpsychism. So what does he mean by that? Well, he begins with this simple proposition. He says that the world, for us, is entirely an object of consciousness, right? Do you agree with that statement? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I mean, on the face of it, it seems like, yeah, the world, for us, and then he qualifies and says, or for all conscious beings, is entirely an object of consciousness. We don't have access to any objects outside of our consciousness, right? By definition, to have access to an object is to be conscious of an object, and so it seems like consciousness is a necessary correlate of the experience of any object. And this is the Kantian transcendental move, right? Consciousness is always, a priori, a correlate of any experience of an object. There's always a subject intending or directed toward an object. That's the structure of experience. And Meixner, building on Kant, building on Husserl, who built on Kant, is adopting this phenomenological or transcendental orientation. where experience is recognized to have a certain structure, a bipolar structure, Meixner says, where there's a subject and an object. A subject intends an object. There's a subject-centeredness to experience and an object-directedness of experience. Now, so far, this sounds a lot like Whitehead's bipolar, or to avoid the psychological connotation, dipolar understanding of experience, where you have a physical pole and a mental pole. Now, the difference for Whitehead from this phenomenological understanding of the structure of experience is that, there are several differences. For one thing, in contrast to the transcendental phenomenologist, Whitehead doesn't think that the same subject can experience different objects. For Whitehead, as he puts it in Process and Reality, no thinker thinks twice, right? The subject of each experience is new, emerges in that experience. Now, sure, there is a continuity whereby past subjectivity is inherited by present subjectivity, and especially within the intimacy of our own organism, of our own bodies and nervous system, there is an intimacy of an inherited experience whereby we have a stream of consciousness, right? I remember who I was yesterday. I went to sleep at night and there was a break, but I woke up in the morning and the continuity was back, right? Whitehead has a way of explaining how, despite the fact that each moment of experience gives rise to a new subject, there is still a continuity. He talks about historical roots of experience, but nonetheless, unlike Husserl and Kant, for whom there was a sort of substantial self, even if we can't ever directly experience that self, nonetheless, for Husserl, there is a subject, it remains the same through experience. This is different for Whitehead. Another difference for Whitehead is that while he does think that conscious experience has this intentional structure, where intentionality is the way that phenomenologists refer to the object-directedness of a subject. So our conscious experiences, our conscious thoughts are always directed at objects, right? That's the intentional structure of consciousness. And for Whitehead, that is perfectly real and happens at the level of our conscious human experience, but there's a deeper layer of experience for Whitehead that has to do with what he calls it's not sense perception, it's not sense perception of objects by a subject, it's what he calls sense reception. It's the causal flow of the feeling of the past into the present, such that the causal flow of the objects in our environment, the push that they give us, streaming into our experience from the past, is in a sense prior to a subject intending. In a way, for Whitehead, it's the objects that intend the subject rather than the subject that intends the objects, because it's the flow of feeling into a newly arising experience. And Whitehead calls these feelings data. They're objective data. They're in our environment as objects. They stream into the formation of a new experience and actually give rise to the subject that prehends them. So the subject for Whitehead is a result of the growing together of objects. And, there's a diachronicity or a processual dimension to this for Whitehead that's not present as much for the phenomenologist, or certainly for Descartes in his way of thinking about the subject's relationship to the object. For Whitehead, this isn't imagined in a spatial way, right, where there's a subject with an internal experience and objects out there in the external world. For Whitehead, the relationship between subject and object is temporalized, such that what is a subject in one moment perishes into an object in the next, which is then inherited by a newly forming subject. So objects grow together into a new subject. And Whitehead refers to this as prehension. And it's only at a very high-grade, complex form of experience that you get intentional experience, the experience of intentionality at the level of consciousness. For Whitehead, before that, the primordial form of experience is prehensional, rather than intentional, and prehensional experience, right, is the inheritance of objects which grow together into a new subject, whereas intentional, conscious experience is a subject intending objects and consciously reflecting on them. So this is an important distinction in Whitehead's way of describing experience that makes it, in a way, not contradictory. It doesn't stand in contradiction to the phenomenological account of experience. I think it just reveals a deeper layer, a more primordial layer of experience that in a way is pre-human, right? Phenomenology is describing the experience of conscious human beings very well. Husserl is brilliant in his account of the structure of human consciousness. Whitehead's going deeper than that. He doesn't say much about conscious human experience. He says some interesting things, but he's really more focused on a more general form of experience, a more primordial form of experience that has to do with an experience of causation, really. Causal efficacy, he refers to it as in Process and Reality. So whereas Meixner, building on Husserl, is very quick to say that intentionality sort of supersedes causality, and that thinking in terms of physical causality is only important when we're doing empirical science and testing hypotheses and so on. For Whitehead, no, we need to link causality and experience. We can't just say that conscious experience subsumes causality and that we can just explain the course of events in the physical world in terms of experiences in consciousness. That's idealism. Whitehead's not an idealist, right? He is a realist. Because for him, causality is itself experiential. That's where his panpsychism really makes some interesting innovations. Causation is prehension for Whitehead, right? The primordial form of experience is the inheritance of feeling from the past by the present. That is causality. So to sum up, Whitehead's panpsychism, in being process relational, is a form of panpsychism that takes emergent evolution seriously. There are new capacities emerging in the course of nature's evolution, but there's never a miraculous leap from mere matter to mind. Nature has been experiential from the beginning for Whitehead, and it's that experiential capacity that has allowed for emergent evolution to occur. Whitehead is not just he's not a reductionistic panpsychist, nor is he just a holistic panpsychist, right? His process relational orientation is an attempt to shift us out of trying to reduce everything to the very small or to the very large, to instead find some tension in the middle, some contrast, wherein we can articulate what experience is in its most concrete sense. And then from there, understand how our form of conscious experience is related to the other forms of experience that are operative in the physical world, just through causation, through chemistry, through all of these other forms of physical activity that may not have our human kind of reflective linguistic consciousness, but that nonetheless are experiential and agential, purposeful, right? Whitehead is also different from the sort of phenomenological idealism that we explored in Meixner's chapter, because Whitehead is an organic realist. He's not an idealist. He thinks that the physical world exists in its own right. It is not a construct of our consciousness. It's not that physical world is reducible to the models of reductionistic science. It's that the physical world, in its causal transactions, is a creative advance. It has aims, and it has interiority, it has experience, right? But he thinks that physical world needs to be respected, taken as real in its own right, and not as the mere intended object of a subject or a transcendental ego. So, Whitehead was once co-teaching a course with an idealist whose name is escaping me, but Whitehead was getting frustrated and said, look, being tackled in rugby, that's what the real is. No one who hasn't been tackled can get a sense for what it means to be a realist, right? Wham! That's an example of Whitehead's commitment to this sense that causation cannot just be subsumed by the intentional structure of consciousness, as Meixner, building on Husserl, attempt.